They say Southern kitchens spoke louder than words. When Mama was mad at Daddy, she didn't argue, she cooked. And Lord, you could taste her feelings in every bite. Instead of shouting, she slammed a skillet on the stove. Instead of tears, she poured her heart into flour, bacon grease, and cayenne pepper. Daddy sat in the living room pretending to read the paper, but the real story was written in the smell of fried chicken popping like fireworks, or beans simmering so long the whole house felt heavy with smoke and salt. These weren't quiet, sweet meals. They were fiery, bold, and stubborn, just like Mama when she had a point to make. And yet, even in her anger, she never stopped feeding everyone else at the table. In fact, those Sunday dinners turned into the most unforgettable feasts of Southern comfort food you could ever imagine. Meals that had you loosening your belt and whispering, "What did Daddy do this time?" So today, we're stepping back into that kitchen. If Mama's cooking stirred up a memory for you, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss another taste of history served hot. Smothered pork chops with onion gravy. If there was ever a dish that carried both comfort and confrontation in the same bite, it was Mama's smothered pork chops with onion gravy. See, when she was mad at Daddy, she didn't just fry those chops, she punished them in the skillet. First came the sear, hard and loud, like thunder cracking in a storm. That sound alone told you dinner was going to be serious. She dredged the chops in seasoned flour, heavy on the black pepper, and dropped them into hot grease until they crisped at the edges. But she never stopped there. Oh no, Mama would slice onions as thick as her patience that day, letting them soften slowly in that same skillet, soaking up every bit of brown flavor left behind. Then came the broth, the flour, and the slow stirring that turned anger into gravy. By the time those chops were smothered under a blanket of rich, peppery onion sauce, the whole kitchen smelled like comfort and warning at the same time. You'd sit at the table knowing better than to ask questions, but when that first bite hit your tongue, tender pork, silky gravy, and onions that nearly melted, you couldn't help but close your eyes in gratitude. This wasn't just supper. It was Mama's way of saying, "I'm mad, but I'll still feed you right." And that's the strange magic of Southern food, it held love and discipline in the same pot. So when you see smothered pork chops on a plate, remember, it's more than a meal. It's a story of grit, grace, and a skillet that spoke louder than words. Red beans and rice with ham hock. Some Sunday dinners took patience. And if Mama was mad at Daddy, patience wasn't exactly her strength. That's why the smell of red beans and ham hock simmering on the stove told you everything you needed to know. Because nothing filled a house with tension and comfort the way this dish did. It always started with the ham hock. Thick, smoky, and tough, just like the mood in the room. Mama dropped it into the pot with onions, celery, garlic, and peppers, letting the sizzle rise before drowning it all in water. Then came the beans, red, dried, and waiting to soften over hours of low, slow cooking. All day long, those beans bubbled. The sound was almost like a ticking clock, reminding everyone at the table that Mama's anger was still simmering. The smoky ham hock released its flavor, turning the beans rich, salty, and deep with soul. She'd stir the pot with slow, deliberate motions, and you didn't dare ask when dinner would be ready, you just waited. By evening, the beans were creamy, thick enough to coat your spoon. She ladled them over rice, each scoop heavy with smoke and spice, then set it down without a word. And when you dug in, fluffy rice soaking up beans rich with pork, you realized why this was one of her most powerful meals. Red beans and rice with ham hock wasn't just food. It was a quiet storm in a bowl, slow-cooked until it carried all the weight of the day. And if Daddy was smart, he ate in silence, because in every bite, Mama had already said her piece. Country-style meatloaf with ketchup glaze. When Mama was mad at Daddy, sometimes she didn't want flash or fancy. She wanted something solid, Something heavy. Something that landed on the table with the same weight as her silence. That's when she made country-style meatloaf with ketchup glaze. This wasn't some dainty dish. It started with ground beef, cheap, filling, and ready to be worked over. Mama mixed it with breadcrumbs, eggs, chopped onions, and a little Worcestershire, her hands moving fast, firm, no nonsense. She packed the mixture tight, shaping it into a dense loaf that held together like her resolve. Every press of her palm said, "I'm in charge here." Into the oven it went, but not before she slathered it with that unmistakable glaze, ketchup mixed with a touch of sugar and vinegar, tangy and sweet with just enough bite. As it baked, the glaze bubbled, caramelizing into a shiny red coat that clung to the loaf like armor. The smell filled the kitchen with a mixture of comfort and caution. You knew better than to ask questions, but you also knew that when that loaf came out of the oven, supper would be unforgettable. Mama sliced it thick, each piece firm but tender inside, steaming with savory goodness. Served alongside mashed potatoes and maybe green beans, it was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and quieted a room. Every bite of that meatloaf was layered, simple ingredients turned powerful, a little sweet, a little sharp, and deeply satisfying. It was food that told a story of strength, stubbornness, and a love that showed up even when the words didn't. Country-style meatloaf with ketchup glaze wasn't just dinner. It was Mama's message, plated and served with a firmness that could only come from her hands. And once you tasted it, you didn't just eat, you listened. Fried catfish with hush puppies. When Mama was mad at Daddy, you could hear it in the kitchen before you ever saw the plate. The sound of hot oil snapping, the hiss of cornmeal batter hitting the skillet, the rhythm of her spatula flipping fish with sharp precision. That was the language of fried catfish night. And if she set a basket of golden hush puppies beside it, you knew she had a lot on her mind. Catfish was a southern staple, but in Mama's hands it became something more. She'd soak the fillets in buttermilk, rolling them afterward in a seasoned cornmeal mix that carried just the right bite of cayenne and black pepper. When she dropped those pieces into sizzling oil, the whole house smelled of comfort wrapped in defiance. The crust turned crisp and golden, the fish inside flaked apart soft as butter. But the real punctuation came with the hush puppies. Mama stirred cornmeal with onions, a splash of buttermilk, and a pinch of sugar, rolling the batter into little spoonfuls before dropping them in the oil. They puffed up into crispy, golden brown bites, each one crunchy on the outside, tender and steamy on the inside. When she carried it all to the table, catfish piled high, hush puppies stacked in a bowl, you didn't ask what Daddy had done. You just reached for a piece, dipped it into tartar sauce or hot sauce, and let the crunch speak for itself. Every bite of fried catfish with hush puppies carried that mix of love and frustration only Southern cooking could deliver. It was bold, it was filling, and it made sure no one left the table hungry or unaware of Mama's mood. Because in the South, fried catfish wasn't just dinner. It was a reminder that the kitchen was Mama's kingdom, and even her anger could taste better than anything else in the world. Buttermilk fried chicken and biscuits. If there was ever a dish that showed Mama's full power in the kitchen, it was buttermilk fried chicken with biscuits. And when she was mad at Daddy, this wasn't just supper, it was a statement so loud you could hear it in every crackle of hot grease. The ritual always started the same. Chicken pieces soaking in cold buttermilk, tenderizing while they waited their turn. Mama would season flour with salt, pepper, paprika, and just enough cayenne to let you know she wasn't in a sweet mood. One by one, she dredged those pieces, her hands moving fast, shaking off the excess with a sharp flick of the wrist. When the chicken hit the skillet, the whole house came alive with sound, oil popping like firecrackers, the skin blistering and browning to a golden crisp. She stood watch with the kind of focus only Mama had, turning each piece until it was perfectly fried, no shortcuts, no mistakes. And just when you thought the meal was finished, she started on the biscuits. Buttery, soft, and rising high in the oven, they came out golden and flaky, steam curling up as she split them open. Some she brushed with melted butter, others she drowned in gravy made from the chicken drippings. When that platter landed on the table, piled high with crispy fried chicken and biscuits stacked on the side, you knew supper wasn't just about feeding bellies. It was about reminding Daddy who truly ran the house. The crunch of that first bite, juicy chicken giving way under the crust, followed by the soft comfort of a biscuit, it was love and fire on the same plate. And though Mama might have been mad, she still made sure no one left hungry. Because in the South, buttermilk fried chicken and biscuits weren't just food. They were authority, comfort, and tradition, all wrapped up in a skillet and an oven's heat. Collard greens cooked with fatback. When Mama was mad at Daddy, the kitchen smelled different. It wasn't sweet or quick, it was deep, smoky, and stubborn. That's how you knew collard greens with fatback were on the stove. And if you ever walked into that house on one of those Sundays, the aroma hit you before the words ever did. Mama would rinse those big, leathery collard leaves, stacking them high before rolling them tight and slicing them into ribbons. She worked fast, the knife chopping sharp and steady, every cut saying more than her mouth ever would. Then into the pot went the fatback, thick strips of cured pork, frying slow until the kitchen filled with a smoky perfume that clung to your clothes. She added onions, garlic, maybe a splash of vinegar, and let the greens cook low and slow, simmering down from tough and bitter into tender, silky perfection. All the while, that pot bubbled like her mood, steady, deliberate, unhurried. It wasn't the kind of dish you rushed. Just like Mama when she was upset, it demanded time. By the time supper rolled around, the greens were dark, rich, and full of flavor, bathed in a broth so good Southerners gave it its own name, pot liquor. That broth was liquid gold, soaked up with cornbread until not a drop was left behind. When Mama set that steaming bowl of collards on the table, you didn't just see food. You saw patience, grit, and history all in one pot. Every bite carried the weight of generations, softened by time but never losing its strength. Collard greens with fatback weren't just Sunday dinner. They were a lesson, a tradition, and a warning all at once. And Daddy knew better than to complain, because when Mama cooked greens like that, the food said everything she didn't. Ham hocks and pinto beans. If the smell of beans filled the house, you knew Mama was in no hurry to cool down. And when she dropped ham hocks into the pot, it meant Daddy had done more than just step on her nerves, he'd planted himself there. Pinto beans and ham hocks weren't a quick fix, they were a long simmer, a slow burn, just like her temper on those Sundays. It started with the hocks, smoked, meaty, and rough. She'd rinse them, pat them dry, then drop them into a pot with a hiss of onions, garlic, and a little lard. The sizzle told you this wasn't going to be a quiet meal. Pinto beans, sorted and soaked, followed close behind, along with bay leaf, black pepper, and just enough salt to remind you she had control of the flavor. Then came the waiting. Hours of gentle bubbling as the beans softened and the hocks released their smoky marrow into the broth. The kitchen filled with an aroma so thick it wrapped around the whole house, settling over the table like a warning and an invitation. By supper time, the beans were tender, creamy, and rich with smoky depth. Mama would pull the ham hocks from the pot, shred the meat, and stir it back in, making the dish hearty enough to stand on its own. Served with cornbread, crusty on the outside, tender in the middle, it was the kind of meal that didn't just feed you, it anchored you. And as you sat there spooning beans over cornbread, watching the steam curl up into the air, you realized this dish wasn't just food. It was a reminder. Pinto beans with ham hocks were about patience, power, and Mama's way of proving that no matter what Daddy had done, she still ran the kitchen. Because in the South, beans weren't just beans. They were a story, a lesson, and a warning simmered until they spoke louder than words. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy. If Mama pulled out the cornbread and the chicken giblets on a Sunday when she was mad at Daddy, you knew she wasn't just cooking, she was laying down a feast with a message. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy wasn't a weekday meal. It was a dish that demanded effort, patience, and a whole lot of feeling. And when Mama was upset, effort was exactly how she worked things out. It always began with cornbread, baked golden in a cast-iron skillet. She'd crumble it into a big bowl, mixing in onions, celery, sage, and sometimes a little day-old biscuit to give it body. Her hands moved quick, decisive, like she was kneading her mood right into the mix. Then she poured in broth until the dressing turned soft and heavy, ready to bake into something rich enough to fill the whole family. But the real crown came with the giblet gravy. Mama boiled the chicken neck, gizzard, liver, and heart, parts most folks turned their noses up at, but in her hands, they became magic. She chopped them fine, whisking them into a thick gravy made from pan drippings, broth, and just enough seasoning to make your tongue dance. When she poured that gravy over the cornbread dressing, the whole dish transformed into southern gold. Each bite was moist, savory, and layered with flavors that only came from tradition and patience. And sitting at that table, you didn't have to ask what Daddy had done, because Mama's message was baked and simmered right there in front of you. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy wasn't just supper. It was a declaration that even in her anger, she could take scraps, stretch them, and turn them into a meal that tasted like love, pride, and power all in one. Shrimp and grits loaded with bacon. When Mama was mad at Daddy, sometimes she didn't go for the slow simmer or the heavy roast. Sometimes, she brought out the skillet and made a dish that was bold, quick, and rich enough to stop a man mid-sentence, shrimp and grits, loaded with bacon. This wasn't a gentle meal. Mama started by frying thick-cut bacon until it crisped and popped in the pan, filling the house with a smoky perfume that clung to your clothes. The grease stayed right where it was, because that's where the shrimp came in, plump, pink, tossed with garlic, onion, and a dash of cayenne that made your lips tingle before you even tasted it. The shrimp cooked fast, searing in that bacon fat until they curled and glistened like jewels in the skillet. Meanwhile, the grits bubbled low and slow on the stove. Mama stirred them steady, adding cream, butter, and sharp cheese until they were smooth, rich, and thick enough to hold a spoon upright. No shortcuts, no rushing, those grits had to be just right. When it all came together, Mama spooned the creamy grits into a bowl, piled the shrimp high on top, and crumbled that crispy bacon over the whole thing like a final flourish. The smell alone was enough to silence the table, but the taste, smoky, spicy shrimp against buttery, cheesy grits, was pure southern thunder. Shrimp and grits loaded with bacon was Mama's way of showing that even in anger, she could still serve up a masterpiece. It wasn't just supper, it was a dish that demanded respect. And Daddy knew better than to argue with it. Because in the South, shrimp and grits aren't just comfort food. They're proof that with a skillet, a little bacon, and a whole lot of grit, Mama could turn her mood into a meal no one ever forgot. Blackened catfish with Cajun spices. When Mama was mad at Daddy, sometimes the skillet came alive with fire, literally. That's when she made blackened catfish, a dish so bold and smoky it carried her mood straight to the table. It always began with the spices. Mama mixed them heavy: paprika, cayenne, garlic powder, onion powder, thyme, oregano, salt, and black pepper. She rubbed that fiery blend deep into every inch of the catfish fillets, pressing it in with the flat of her hand like she was sealing her feelings right into the flesh. Then came the heat. She cranked the cast-iron skillet until it was smoking, the kind of heat you could see shimmering in the air. A little butter went in, sputtering and browning instantly, and then the fish hit the pan with a sear that sounded like thunder rolling through the house. The spices darkened, forming a charred, smoky crust while the inside stayed tender and flaky. Every flip of the spatula sent up clouds of spice and butter so strong they filled the whole kitchen, making your eyes water and your stomach growl. Mama plated that blackened catfish with rice or maybe cornbread on the side, setting it down without a word. The first bite hit you with layers of heat, smoky, peppery, fiery, but softened with the buttery richness of the fish itself. It was a balance of anger and comfort, stubbornness and care, all served in one sizzling dish. Blackened catfish wasn't just food, it was Mama's fire, her way of saying she wasn't afraid to turn up the heat when Daddy tested her patience. And though the burn lingered, so did the flavor, deep, smoky, unforgettable. Because in the South, blackened catfish isn't just supper. It's a skillet full of pride, grit, and a little bit of warning, served hot enough to leave its mark. Barbecue ribs slow-cooked all day. When Mama was mad at Daddy, you could smell it before you knew it, you'd catch the slow, smoky perfume drifting from the backyard, and that meant ribs were on. Not just any ribs. These were the kind that clung to the bone until hours of patience and fire turned them tender enough to fall apart with a glance. Mama never rushed them. That was the secret. She'd rub those pork ribs with a blend of brown sugar, salt, paprika, garlic, and just a kiss of cayenne. It was sweet and fiery, just like her mood. She laid them over a low fire, charcoal and a chunk or two of hickory, and then she waited. The smoke did the talking while she stayed quiet. Every hour or so, Mama brushed on her sauce. Thick, sticky, and sharp with vinegar, it clung to the ribs like a second skin. The more coats she painted on, the shinier they became, until the whole rack glistened like burnished mahogany under the sunlight. Daddy might have sat in the other room sulking, but those ribs crackled and whispered with every lick of flame, promising that supper was going to be worth the tension. By the time she brought them inside, the meat slid from the bone with the gentlest tug. The sauce dripped down your chin, sweet and smoky, while the rub still burned on your tongue. You didn't just eat Mama's ribs, you surrendered to them. See, ribs weren't just food in our house. They were Mama's way of showing Daddy that patience had power, that fire could be controlled, and that the sweetest victories came low and slow. And when she laid that platter on the table, piled high with sticky ribs, there was no denying it, Mama might have been mad, but she knew how to turn that fire into something unforgettable. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy. Now, when Mama was good and mad at Daddy, she didn't just make supper, she made a statement. And nothing said "I'll show you" quite like a big pan of cornbread dressing drowned in rich, golden giblet gravy. First came the cornbread itself. Not the boxed kind, mind you, Mama wouldn't touch that. She baked hers from scratch in a blackened cast iron skillet, edges crisp and buttery, middle soft and crumbly. Once it cooled, she'd crumble it with her hands, almost like tearing away pieces of her frustration, mixing it with day-old biscuits, onions, celery, and sage. The scent alone filled the kitchen with a warmth that dared anyone to complain. While that dressing baked, Mama worked her quiet magic on the giblet gravy. She boiled the chicken neck, heart, and liver, pulling every ounce of flavor into a rich broth. Most folks these days wrinkle their noses at the idea, but back then, wasting anything was unthinkable. Mama seasoned that broth with black pepper and a splash of milk, then thickened it to a silky pour that could make cardboard taste like Sunday heaven. When she set that pan of cornbread dressing on the table, golden on top with just the right crisp, and then ladled that gravy over it, smooth, savory, and almost velvety, it wasn't just dinner. It was power. Daddy might have sulked, but with every forkful, we kids knew we were eating history, pride, and a little dose of stubborn love. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy wasn't meant for fancy company. It was survival food, turned into a feast by Southern hands that refused to waste or settle. And on those nights when tempers were high, Mama's dressing reminded us all that in her kitchen, nothing, and no one, was going to be wasted. Because if Mama had to swallow her pride, well, you better believe Daddy was going to swallow every bite of that dressing and gravy until his plate was clean. Chicken fried steak with white gravy. When tempers flared in the house, Mama didn't need words to prove her point, she let the skillet do the talking. And nothing hit the table harder, both in flavor and in message, than a platter of chicken fried steak smothered in thick, creamy white gravy. Mama always started with cube steak, the kind of cut that looked humble but had fight in it, much like her. She'd dredge each piece through seasoned flour, dip it in buttermilk, then back into the flour again, her hands moving quick and firm, like she was pounding the anger right out of her day. Into the sizzling hot oil it went, crackling like a storm as the kitchen filled with the smell of something fried, salty, and irresistible. By the time the steaks came out golden brown and crisp around the edges, you could almost feel the tension in the house give way to the aroma. But Mama wasn't done yet. Into that same skillet went flour, milk, and plenty of black pepper, whisked together into the kind of country gravy that clung to every bite and made sure not a crumb was wasted. She'd pour it slow, letting it cascade over the steaks until they were drowned in creamy perfection. When Mama slid that platter onto the table, she wasn't just serving dinner, she was laying down the law. Daddy might have been the reason for her fury, but he was also the one who had to cut into that crispy crust, the gravy soaking in, and chew every last bite without complaint. And for us kids, well, that was the kind of Sunday dinner that felt like both a punishment and a blessing. Because chicken fried steak wasn't just food. It was Southern grit, fried to a golden brown, smothered in gravy thick enough to stick to your bones, and to Mama's pride. Collard greens with fatback. When Mama was riled up, you could hear it in the way she slammed that heavy pot onto the stove. And if collard greens were on the menu, you knew the storm had landed. Collards weren't just a side dish in our house, they were a slow-cooked sermon, simmered low and long with fatback until every leaf carried a flavor as deep as Mama's mood. She'd start with a bundle of dark, leathery collard leaves, the kind that needed coaxing to turn tender. With her knife flashing quick, she stripped the stems, chopped them into ribbons, and tossed them into the pot like she was shaking off frustration. Then came the fatback, thick, salty strips of cured pork that hissed and sizzled in the bottom of the pan, releasing a smoky perfume that crept into every corner of the kitchen. As the greens simmered with onions, vinegar, and a pinch of sugar to balance the bitterness, Mama stirred with steady, sharp movements. You could tell she wasn't just cooking, she was working something out, letting the steam carry away what she didn't say out loud. Hours later, when that pot lid lifted, the greens had transformed into something soulful, velvety, smoky, tangy, and rich with the essence of patience. When she ladled them into a big bowl, a little pot liquor shimmering at the bottom, the room grew quiet. Daddy might shift uncomfortably in his chair, the unspoken tension still hanging, but one bite of those greens softened even the hardest silence. Served with cornbread to sop up every drop, the collards became a reminder that even bitterness can be tamed if you give it time and the right seasoning. And that's how Mama did it. Her collard greens weren't just dinner. They were discipline, comfort, and defiance, all simmered together in one pot.